We're going to do some property first today, and then we're going to do wills and trusts. The reason I'm going to start with the property is because I really think property is something they will test this time. Wills administration, though, as well, so we're going to do that second, and then we'll do the trust essay, because you can never count trust out. Now, when it comes to property, I've picked a question today that has a heavy dose of MBE in it. Before we jump in, I'm going to have you read it in a second. Definitely has a heavy dose of MBE for a reason. They like to have questions that have kind of a common law flavor, but with Florida twists, and this question is one that does. Plus, it also then helps you as you study the materials for the Florida portion of the exam. So I'm going to ask you to take just a few minutes to read the question first and do a quick issue spot, and then we'll jump in and break it apart. Thanks, Juan. Okay, let's go ahead and get started because we have a lot we're going to cover today, and I don't want to keep you late. I know we had a few people who came in late, but you can kind of catch up. Dean is drawing a picture. That's really good. This is a hard question to do if you don't draw the picture. You have to know who's doing what to whom. When it comes to property in particular, pictures can be very helpful. So take the time to get it laid out, and you can see here where the lake is and who crosses whose property to get to the lake. So let's start up at the top, and Art has lot number 1, and Bud is the owner of lot number 2. It's right behind lot 1, and it looks over lot 1 to the lake. So right away we know that Bud is going to be interested in his, what word? He's looking over at the lake. He wants to preserve his what? His view, right? So as soon as, and you want to take clues from the fact pattern. So he wants view right away. To me, bells and whistles go off because I know that we're going to be talking about a negative easement. Now, at common law, of course, there are 4 negative easements: light, air, water, and lateral and subjacent support. But Florida recognizes an easement of view. And so you can see that it's a common law question, but it's got a Florida twist to it. That easement of view is something that we actually recognize that other states don't necessarily recognize. Lot 1 is landlocked by the lake, and Lot 2, that's going to tell us we're going to be talking. I don't know what caused that. That we're going to be looking to see if there's any kind of way we can help Lot 1 out, because he's got to have ingress and egress, which makes you think about what kind of an easement. Necessity? Well, right. Now, an easement by necessity is a type of implied easement. And of course, for an implied easement, you have to have initial unity of ownership, severance of the unity, and some degree of necessity. What seems to be missing here? Unity of ownership, right? So that common law implied easement, and when we're talking about an easement by necessity, you need strict necessity. If it's just an implied easement with prior use, then you need just reasonable necessity. It doesn't work here. But once again, we're going to see Florida has a statutory easement of way by necessity that doesn't require the initial unity of ownership. We recognize the common law implied easement, but we also have the statutory easement. So you're actually going to discuss both, looking at the common law rule and looking at the Florida rule. Now, and there's a dirt road, but nobody refers to the dirt road, so we know we don't have an express easement as to the dirt road. Then in 1975, Art and Bud signed an agreement Bud pays Art $3,000 in return for Art's promise not to build any structure on Lot 1 that would block Bud's view of the lake. So what is that? It might be a covenant. And so we're going to have to consider covenants that run with the land. But it also could be an attempt to create a negative easement. A negative easement cannot be created any other way than by a writing. So we have a writing here. And of course, the view is not one of those 4 traditional negative easements that we recognize in common law, but Florida law. If you have a writing and you create that easement of view, negative easement of view, it might be enforceable. So we're going to analyze that little writing 2 ways, negative easement and possibly covenant / servitude. Dean?
I mean, it's unlikely that the question won't state that it's in Florida, but if it's not, is it implied that you stick to the common law?
Yeah, well, no. It's a really good question. What you should do, and of course they say Crystal County, Florida, so they're telling you here, occasionally they don't. If they don't, then tell them you presume the question was set in Florida, because they will be looking for Florida law, unless, and we talked about earlier, every so often they do say, analyze this question under the federal Constitution. If they don't want you to use Florida law, they'll tell you.
Okay.
So if they don't give you a county or a city or something, just say we're going to presume it's set in Florida. All right, so then the document's never recorded, and of course that's going to raise what issue? Notice to a subsequent third-party purchaser for value. What kind of recording statute do we have in Florida? We have a notice statute. So if you don't know that yet, make sure you know it. They love to throw that in. That's a frequently tested concept. Since 1970, Bud has used a path along the east side of Art's lot to reach the lake. What are they setting up there? What kind of an easement?
Easement by prescription.
Prescription. It can't be implied, because he's just, for several reasons. First of all, we don't have that unity of ownership, so it can't be an implied easement. And second, there's no necessity. He just uses the path to get to the lake. He likes to visit the lake, but he's not, but, is it Bud? Yeah, Bud. He's in Lot 2. It's not landlocked. But prescriptive easement, very definitely. In 1975, over the years, Bud has kept the path clear of overgrowth and installed railroad ties along the side. What are they trying to show you there? Well, prescriptive easement's like adverse possession, isn't it? Yeah, and so, okay. And it also might be setting up another kind of easement. Easement by estoppel. Ah, yeah. Because if he has permission, which of course would negate the prescription, then it might be an easement by estoppel. Because he set all this stuff up, he relied, he spent money. You see what? Always, always, always pick at those facts. Don't just pass over a fact and say, whatever. Why is it there? In 1975, Charlie, who's the owner of Lot 3, he jumps in and he starts using the path too. So now we have both Bud and Charlie using the path. And once again, sorry about that. I guess I can't step right in front of that. Once again, we may, at a minimum, have a prescriptive easement as to Charlie. So now Art complains, and he posts a no trespassing sign, but Bud and Charlie continue. Now, if he just posts a sign, that will show something. It'll show what? That the use is not what? It's not permissive, which actually helps Bud and Charlie at this point because they just keep going. And has he interrupted their use in any way by posting the sign? Not really. You contrast that to Rockefeller Center. You know, they have the road that runs through the center. Once a year, they actually close the street, interrupts the use to prevent a prescriptive easement. But here, he didn't do that. He just posted the sign, and it actually helps Bud and Charlie because it boosts their claim that they walk without permission, which is important to prescription. So now last year, Art died and daughter inherited Lot 1. Well, she steps into Art's shoes, right? She's not a subsequent bona fide purchaser for value, and so the recording statute won't protect her. Before he died, he told daughter about the agreement, and she's not a bona fide purchaser for value, so notice, even though that agreement wasn't recorded, the recording statute isn't going to really help her out here anyway. Plus, he told her about it, so she has actual notice. Last month, daughter constructed an addition on the house, and of course, what does it do? It blocks the view. And she told Bud and Charlie they can't use the path. Well, if they've already gained an easement by prescription, she's out of luck. So, Bud fenced off the dirt road, blocking daughter's access to Lot 1. Can he do that? Not if she has an easement, but we have to determine whether Art, her father, gained an easement that she can now take advantage of. So it's a somewhat broad call of the question, and the questions tend to be a little more specific now, but still the issues are really clear, because it says discuss the parties' potential rights and remedies and include any defenses that could be raised. Well, if we go through the various interests that have been created, the answer kind of writes itself. And the good news about easements and covenants, there is sort of a general arc that's going to be in place anytime you write about them. Because first you have to identify what it is. Then second, has it been properly created? If it's been properly created, what's its scope? And then once you've dealt with its scope, can it be transferred? And then finally, can it be terminated? Any easement or covenant question is going to deal with all of those issues. And same thing for the MBE. And again, one of the reasons why I picked this question, because it gives you a lot of good MBE advice as well. So we're going to look at daughter's right-of-way over the dirt road, which of course she inherited from Art, her dad, Bud's view of the lake, and Bud and Charlie's right-of-way over the path to the lake. Any questions so far? Okay, let's take a look at what we have then. Starting with her right-of-way. Now, notice, and you'll recall from last week, I put in more than I might talk about if I were actually writing the answer. So I mentioned the 3 ways that we can create an easement: express, implied, prescriptive. We don't have an express easement in respect to the dirt road. It's there. No writing mentions it. And of course, an express easement is one that's created in writing. An easement's an interest in land, right? So if you're going to create it expressly, you have to have the writing. But I put that there for you to remember to think about it. And so I'm going to go past that, because clearly there is no express easement here. What about an implied easement? Notice now that I divided up common law first and then statutory. You could do it in the other order. It won't matter. You can do the statutory, the Florida rule first if you like, and then the common law, but you have to discuss both. So for a common law implied easement, and whether it's an implied easement with a prior use or what people like to call an easement by necessity, you need 3 things. First, you need the initial unity of ownership, a big piece of property that's then severed, divided up, and then the requisite degree of necessity. If there is prior use, that quasi-easement sometimes called, then all you need is reasonable necessity. If there's no prior use, then you need strict necessity. Common law, again, we're going to see a slightly different rule for Florida. So here are our 3 elements. I lay them out, but now I'm going to discuss each one separately. So I'm going to say first sub-issue, initial unity of ownership. Try as much as possible when you're writing your essays to bring law and fact together, because it's when you integrate law and fact that the analysis becomes clear. If you have just a bunch of rules over here and a bunch of facts over there, and you don't bring them together, it's not analysis. And you will be graded on your ability to show analysis. So, let's start first with unity of ownership. Did we have it here? Yeah, not to the best of our knowledge. So, honestly, you probably don't have an implied easement because there was no unity of ownership. If you wanted to say, but if there was then, you could. In the interest of time, however, you might need to say, there's no initial unity of ownership, and so an implied easement wasn't created. And then go on to the statutory easement to make sure that you talk about the statutory easement, because the facts clearly are raising that statutory easement. I did, again, more as a study guide than anything else, I said, there's no initial unity of ownership, but if she can show it then, so you can see what all the steps are. And I'm going to go past this part here because, again, it's what I just explained. If there is that prior use, the quasi-easement, then you just need reasonable necessity. If, however, there is no prior use, then you need strict necessity. There is a prior use here, right? Because Art was using that dirt path for quite some time, and then daughter continued to use it after she inherited the property from Art. So if you get past the problem with unity of ownership, well, okay, then reasonable necessity is probably all that's required here. And it's the only way in and out of that lot, because it's bounded by the lake on one side and lot 2 on the other, which is why the drawing that Dean was making is important. You want to be able to visualize quickly and see that that parcel is landlocked. So the necessity probably is reasonable. It's just that that initial unity of ownership is missing. So now, and notice what I did here, again, as a study guide. We've already decided that there wasn't an implied easement, so the rest of this stuff could be left out, and probably would be left out when you're writing an answer in an hour's time. But as I mentioned before, you got to discuss whether the easement has been created and its scope, which I did on the previous page, and then talk about whether it can be transferred. And of course, it was transferred in this case from Art to his daughter when she inherited the property. And how long is it going to last? When you have an easement by necessity, it lasts as long as the necessity exists, right? Which is different from other easements. If it's by necessity, it is bounded by the existence of the necessity. If daughter found another way out of the lot, the easement by necessity would be terminated. And an important point, the reason I raise it here is because we're going to see a contrast when we get to the Florida rule. For an implied easement, whether it's based on prior use or no prior use, if the court finds that the easement exists, the owner of the Servian estate, which would be Bud? Yeah, but getting my parties mixed up, would not be entitled to compensation under the common law. The easement's just imposed, period, end of story. We're going to see, however, with the statutory easement of way by necessity, if the court imposes an easement under that statute, compensation is due to the owner of the Servian estate. So you want to draw that contrast to show that you know the common law, which is applicable in Florida, plus you know the Florida law, which has a different rule. So let's look at that statutory easement. How many of you, by the way, in your studies, how many of you have come across the statutory easement of way by necessity up to this point? Yeah, you probably have. It's there. They like to test it. Another reason why I picked this question, it's a frequent flyer on the Florida portion, because it's a very clear set of rules, easy to write a fact pattern for, and because it's different from the common law. As I mentioned last week, if you write an essay that's just about the common law and you don't bring in Florida law, you're not going to get a great score, unless it's a contracts essay, because then the law is pretty much the same. But if it's torts, if it's property, wills and trusts, Florida common law, whatever it is, if you really want to show that you know Florida law, those Florida rules matter a lot. At this point, here we are, you're just a couple of weeks out from the exam. You need to make sure you know those Florida distinctions. And do not wait, please do not wait until the last week to look at the Florida distinctions. Because here's what's going to happen if you wait till the last week. You go, oh my God, I don't have time to look. And so you never look at the Florida distinctions, or you look at the Florida distinctions in the last couple days of your studies, and you learn the Florida distinctions, and then you forget everything else you learned. So you don't want to be learning new stuff in the roughly week and a half to 2 weeks right before the exam. Take the time right now to learn anything Florida distinction-wise that you haven't learned yet. So here's our statutory easement of way by necessity. We need some things. First of all, you need a parcel that's located outside a municipality. The statute does not apply to urban areas. It's got to be outside a municipality, and they don't say here, but it sure sounds like it probably is. So I'm going to go forward. I'm going to say, well, it's on a lake, and you got paths to the lake, and it's probably not urban. Second, the parcel has to be used for dwelling or agricultural purposes. That one's easy to satisfy here because Art lived in the house and then daughter lived in the house. So we definitely have dwelling purposes. Third, the land has to be hemmed in, so much so that there's no reasonable means of entrance and exit. And clearly, Lot 1 is landlocked. That's where the picture comes into play and the fact pattern. So far so good. If the parcel is in a rural area, which it sort of seems like it is, and we know it's used as a house and it's hemmed in, then here's what happens. The court will order the easement to be enforced, but compensation is due to the owner of the servient estate. So assuming, once again, that this is a rural area, because daughter lives in the house and because the parcel is landlocked, the easement will be enforced, that dirt road easement across Lot 1 will be enforced, and compensation is due to Bud, in stark contrast to the common law, which will not require compensation to Bud if that implied easement is even recognized. Questions so far? Okay, but we're not done with daughter's right-of-way. There was no express easement, but it could be implied or it could be prescriptive.
The statutory is a Florida distinction?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, that's a Florida statute. I don't know if I have the statute number there. I think it's in the packet. I don't remember now. But yeah, there's a Florida statute that lays out the requirements that I just mentioned. And they do like to test it. It comes up every couple of years. So don't ignore it, because that gets you a lot of points if you can talk about Florida law there. Many people who wrote this question didn't have a clue about the Florida rule. The people who did got a much higher score than the people who didn't. Yeah, Frank, come on in. Packet's right there. Okay, so, but we got to talk about prescriptive easement too. And the nice thing about a prescriptive easement is that, for the most part, the same elements that you use for adverse possession, you use for a prescriptive easement, with a few variations on the theme. First and foremost, adverse possession is about possession. Prescriptive easement is about use. So you want to make sure you make the vocabulary distinction. And second, while I said that most of the elements are the same, the one that some jurisdictions don't require at all, or if they do, it's very limited when it comes to prescriptive easements, is exclusivity. Which is relevant here, because it doesn't say that daughter's the only one using that path. Other people might be using it too. For possession to be adverse, the possession has to be exclusive. But for a prescriptive easement, it's oftentimes shared with the owner of the property and can be shared with other individuals. The only sharing you can't have for a prescriptive easement, unless it's a public prescriptive easement, is sharing with the public in general. And there's no indication here that the public at large is using this path. So any way that you learned the elements, either in your property class way back when or as you studied the materials for the bar, there's no specific order that you have to discuss the elements for prescription or adverse possession. Just make sure you get them all out there. So I'll give you the order I go in, but it's not the only way to attack it. First, you've got to have open use. Well, daughter's open. She's walking up and down the path. Easy. It's got to be actual. Easy here again because she's actually walking on the path. Hostile. You may recall from your property class there are different views of hostility. What you're going to use here is, and unless, even when it comes to the MBE, usually they're going to use the majority approach, which is the objective approach. So as long as you're intending to use the property, you don't have to have anything more. You don't have to be the aggressive trespasser and know it's somebody else's property. You don't have to be the innocent trespasser, the good faith trespasser who thinks it's his own and it turns out it's somebody else's. You just have to intend to use the property. And she did. And apparently without Bud's permission. There isn't anything that says he said, come on down, walk on my path. Continuous. Florida, for a prescriptive easement, will use the 20-year common law period and make sure that you say it's the common law period, but Florida uses it. Once again, showing that you know Florida law. Daughter hasn't been walking there for 20 years. Don't forget about tacking, because clearly, if Art was walking there long enough, she was in privity with Art, because she inherited from Art, so that's going to satisfy privity. She can tack on her use to his use. And her year-long use is tacked on. I don't know when Art first, they don't tell you when Art first started. It seems like it was a long time, though. So what would I say here? Assuming Art walked on it long enough to tack on with Daughter, the 20 years would be satisfied. I just mentioned exclusivity. It doesn't really matter, probably in this case, because it doesn't look like the public at large was using the path. Now, what's the remedy? Because remember, Bud tried to block off the road. So if he interferes substantially, then she's got a remedy. She can get money damages, she can get injunctive relief. And she can prevent, if we prove the prescriptive easement, she can prevent Bud from blocking her off. Okay, so any questions about Daughter's right-of-way? The two main things then that you want to make sure you would hit on this question would be the implied easement / statutory easement of way by necessity and the prescriptive easement. So, yes, sir.
When we're addressing the prescriptive easement section, we just make for our heading just the issue and then just list the elements and talk about one by one, right?
Yeah. The issue is, was there a prescriptive easement? You could say a prescriptive easement has to be open, actual, hostile, list them, but then say first element and try, once again, to discuss each element separately. It's a lot easier for your grader. Remember, your grader's got a grading sheet, and they're going check, 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 check. If you break them down element by element so they don't have to keep searching, you just get more points.
So, decent. So what you just did, you just took Daughter and just dealing with her right away over the dirt road and looking at the different types of easement that she could have claimed rights that she thinks she could have. And then conclude whether it's there or not based on the elements.
That's right. And now I'm going to look at Bud, and then I'll look at Bud and Charlie with the path to the lake. So you could order the question up differently. You could take all of the prescriptive claims together if you wanted to, but they're not identical in this case. Well, Bud and Charlie are identical, but Bud and Charlie are different from Daughter. So I made a choice here and grouped by plaintiff. You can group any way you want as long as it works for you. And one of the things you have to do when you read the question and you have multiple plaintiffs, multiple defendants, multiple causes of action, torts, another place, right? We talked about that last week with products liability, right? Make a decision up front. If I have a question that has multiple plaintiffs, multiple defendants, multiple causes, how am I going to write about it? But decide it. Honestly, decide it before you go into the exam. It's one of the reasons why you want to do practice questions, right? So when you get a question that looks kind of like this, it's a fairly typical type of fact pattern, you already know going in, here's how I'm going to write about it. It does so much for you. It gives you some confidence, because you can write something, right? And it saves you time. And time can really be an issue on these questions. If you already know the approach you're going to take and the structure, the framework of your discussion, then you fill in the blanks based on the facts in the case. You will get your answer written much more completely and much more quickly than will the person who sits down and says, wow, it's an easement. What do I do with an easement? So the more you practice ahead, the more you have these game plans. And that's a big part of what I'm trying to give you in these classes. How do you think about the subject? The better off you'll be. Okay, any other questions before we look at Bud's view? Okay, negative easement, covenant, and it really should say covenant/servitude because it's going to be one or the other depending on the remedy primarily. We're going to start with the negative easement, which I mentioned before. And clearly, they wanted you to talk about negative easement. They set it up that way because it's blocking the view. And you would start by saying, you know, that you have 4 negative easements at common law, but Florida also recognizes a negative easement of view. So we know we can talk about it in Florida. But how do we create it? Remember I said, as soon as you identify what it is, you have to talk about its creation. You cannot have a negative easement created by implication or prescription or estoppel. The only way to create a negative easement is with a writing. And guess what? They gave you a writing. Which is another clue that they really did want you to talk about negative easement here. So, it looks like the negative easement could have been created. If it's been created, then the question, of course, is whether daughter had notice, because she is not the original party to the writing. It was her dad. Here's where you say Florida's got a notice recording statute. And, of course, an easement, and they love to test this particular point, terminating an easement through the recording statute. Because, of course, with an easement that's been created by prescription, there's no writing. And so if the property is transferred to a subsequent bona fide purchaser for value, that person can't have record or constructive notice of the easement. If it was created by prescription, there's no writing. So it makes a very easy question. Now, of course, in this case, daughter isn't going to be protected by the statute. So the recording statute doesn't help her out. Plus, daughter had actual notice anyway. So she didn't pay value. She's not protected by the statute. Even if she had paid value, she had actual notice. What other kind of notice might she have had here if she didn't have the actual notice? Inquiry notice, yeah, because the house was just the one story, and she could tell that Art could, or not Art, Bud could have seen over the house. So that easement, if it was a negative easement of view created by that writing, it was not terminated by the transfer to daughter because she's not protected by the recording statute. But we want to analyze it in the alternative, because maybe it was a covenant/servitude, which nobody likes, but they like to test a lot. It shows up certainly on the MBE portion of the exam, and unfortunately shows up more than you might like on the Florida portion. So being able to write about it helps. Well, element by element again. Depending on who you had for property and what approach they took to it, you know, you may not have discussed all of the elements all of the time. I would recommend that you take all the traditional elements and knock them out, knock them down, and say, modern trend doesn't require this one anymore, but in this case. So first thing we start with is a writing. If you have a covenant that runs with the land at law, then it has to be created by writing. Statute of frauds. Plain and simple. That's a rule that you're going to see in any jurisdiction. If the enforcement is a covenant that runs with the land at law. If, on the other hand, the enforcement is a servitude, an equitable servitude, you don't necessarily need a writing. Well, look at the difference. Law requires the writing, equity doesn't. And if money damages is what your injured party wants, then you're enforcing at law, got to have that writing. If specific performance, negative injunction, is the remedy that's sought, then you're in equity. So make sure that you make those distinctions. And again, I break it down here a lot. You might kind of fast forward a little bit, but you start with that writing. It wasn't present in this case. And because it wasn't present, then, oh, I'm sorry, we're talking about the view. Oops. Sorry, got the facts wrong. There was a writing for the view. Oops, I apologize. It was the path that wasn't in writing. So we have a writing. Now the next question is, if we have a writing, is there intent for the covenant to run expressed in the writing? Because when we say intent, that's what we're talking about here. The writing itself has to say that the covenant binds heirs and assigns for the benefit of heirs and assigns. That's what shows that the covenant runs. And we don't have any express language in this particular writing. So under strict common law, you actually would have a problem. But, of course, here's where modern law can come into play. So under the modern approach, the court's going to look at the surrounding circumstances. And in this case, look at the language. And once again, I like to use the facts as much as possible. And I'm sure that the drafter of the question was headed in this direction, because it says to assure an unobstructed view from Bud's house. From the house, not an individual, right? And since we're talking about the view from the house rather than an individual's view, you can extrapolate, or you can at least, with a straight face, extrapolate intent for the benefit to run. If you say, it was personal, then you've decided on the facts. That's your decision. But if you look at that language, which I'm sure they wanted you to examine carefully, it does suggest that there was an implied intent for the covenant to run. So next we need privity. There isn't much left to horizontal privity, right? In most jurisdictions, you don't even need it anymore. But I would at least mention it. Horizontal privity, the relationship between the original covenantor and covenantee, Art and Bud in this case. And in Florida, you probably don't need it anymore. But if you needed it here, it didn't exist, right? Because Art and Bud were just neighbors. So I would point it out and say, well, it doesn't. Horizontal privity doesn't exist here, but we probably don't need it. I don't have a specific Florida rule here. So I can only surmise that Florida probably follows the restatement. But again, at least I mention it to show I know what the elements are. Next is vertical privity. So we need privity between the original covenantor or covenantee and an assignee. Our assignee in this case is daughter. Was she in vertical privity with her father? Sure she was, because she inherited his property. So if we need vertical privity, in some jurisdictions you don't need it. But if you need it, it's present in this case. Dean?
What would have destroyed vertical privity?
If she'd been an adverse possessor.
Okay. But otherwise, a regular transfer or devise.
Regular transfer, devise,
Intestacy.
intestacy works. But adverse possession wouldn't. Yeah. All right, so if we can get past the horizontal privity issue, which we probably can, because most jurisdictions don't require it, and if we need vertical privity, we're good, because she inherited the property from her dad. Next element, touch and concern. The benefit has to touch and concern, the burden has to touch and concern. Use the traditional test. The restatement has a really funky test when it comes to touch and concern. I wouldn't use it. Traditional test says the benefit touches and concerns the benefited property if it increases the value of the benefited property. Traditional rule says the burden touches and concerns the burden property if it lowers the value of the burden property. So in this case, benefit, who gets the benefit? Daughter at this point, right? Does the covenant, if we treat it as a covenant, does it increase the value of her property? Well, yeah, because she's got this lovely view of the lake. The house is probably worth more with the view of the lake. So I would say that the benefit does touch and concern daughter's property. What about the burden? Does the burden lower the value of Bud's property? And the answer is yes, because he can't build that second story that he wants to build. Did I get my names? I got my names.
He's going to lose the view.
He's going to lose the view, not daughter. I'm sorry. I got my names backwards. I'm not doing well today. I do that when I'm tired. I flip names. So please, if I do it, challenge me. So the benefit is for Bud. The burden is on daughter. I apologize. And in any event, she, of course, is in vertical privity with her father because she inherited the property from him. So both benefit and burden touch and concern in this case. We've got a writing. We probably don't need horizontal privity. It was missing, but we probably don't need it. Vertical privity is present, and touch and concern is present.
Intent.
I'm sorry, thank you, the intent, which we're going to imply. Now, the only last question is, anybody tell me what the last question is? Notice, thank you, Michael. Yeah, notice. Notice that I put notice last. Then I have some property students out there, so you've heard this before. When these rules developed for covenants that run with the land at law/servitudes, they developed in England, and England didn't have any recording statutes at the time. We're the ones in the United States that actually came up with the idea of recording statutes, and England actually borrowed from us. So notice, even though a lot of your materials will say notice is a requirement, it's an element of a covenant or a servitude. It really isn't. It's separate. It's something that is imposed on those requirements by statutes. But we do have a recording statute in Florida, and so the question is, did daughter have notice of this covenant? Well, we already discussed whether she had notice. She didn't have record notice because it wasn't recorded, but she did have actual notice. Plus, once again, she was not a bona fide purchaser because she took by inheritance, and so she's not protected by the recording statute. So 2 reasons why she cannot hide behind the recording statute. 1, she's not protected because she's not a bona fide purchaser, and 2, although she did not have constructive notice, she did have actual notice. So, if we label the writing as a covenant, it could be possibly enforced against daughter. But if we label it as a covenant, the remedy is money damages. And that's what Bud would get, which is probably not what Bud wants. And so we repeat the process with an equitable servitude. Equitable servitudes are the flip side of a covenant that runs. And you talk about an equitable servitude if one or both of the following is present. The biggest thing is the remedy. And in most cases, the remedy is going to determine. If your plaintiff is seeking money damages, you're talking about a covenant that runs with land at law. If the plaintiff is seeking injunctive relief, you're talking about an equitable servitude. your plaintiff might also have to couch the promise, if you will, as an equitable servitude if some of the requirements at common law are not met. Because there are, I call them substitutes in equity. The rules are relaxed in equity. So, number one, of course, is the writing. We have one, but remember in equity, you can use estoppel in part performance as exceptions to the statute of frauds writing requirement. Well, we've got a writing here. Intent, intent is going to be implied from the circumstances here anyway. You usually see the intent issue coming up in the context of a subdivision development, because you can use that common scheme to show intent for the covenant to run. Well, we don't have a subdivision here, but we don't need it anyway, because from the language of the document itself, the unobstructed view of the lake from the house, we can imply intent for the covenant to run. Now, privity. You definitely don't need horizontal privity in equity, and you probably don't need it in, you probably don't need vertical privity either. If you do, though, we showed that it was present because daughter inherited from her father. Touch and concern is probably even more important in equity than it is at law. When we talk about a covenant that runs with the land, it attaches to the land, but an equitable servitude is an interest in land. We say it really digs its tentacles into the land. So touch and concern, make sure if you're talking about an equitable servitude that you discuss touch and concern in the same way we just did. Both the benefit and the burden, touch and concern in this case. Notice, same thing we talked about before. Look what you can do as time progresses. Particularly if you're writing by hand, you're going to have to do it. If you're typing, you can also do it, as discussed above. It's another reason why I grouped the way I did. It was efficient, because I could start, as I got about halfway through the answer, I could start to refer back to sections I already covered. Any questions about the view of the lake, either the negative easement or the covenant/servitude? Okay, last up, the path. And once again, we've covered a lot of the stuff already, implied easement, prescriptive easement, so we can go kind of quickly. We do want to talk about estoppel, though, because we haven't covered that yet. There's no writing, so you don't have to talk about an express easement. You can mention there's no writing if you like, but don't spend a lot of time on it. Implied easement, it's not going to work here, right? Because we didn't have initial unity of ownership. What about that statutory easement of way by necessity? Is that going to help Bud and Charlie out here? Danny? I'm sorry. The question is, remember that daughter, because she's got landlocked land, can take advantage of the statutory easement of way by necessity. The question is, can Bud and Charlie take advantage of the statutory easement of way by necessity and impose an easement on daughter to get to the lake?
Maybe if they need to fish.
They have to show that their land is landlocked, don't they? So hemmed in that there's no reasonable means of ingress or egress. Can they show that their land is hemmed in? Nope. They hem daughter in, but there are no facts suggesting that they can't get in and out. Plus, they're using the path to get to the lake. It's not for ingress and egress into and out of their property. They're just using it to get to the lake. So the answer is, first of all, they cannot claim an implied easement, because that unity of ownership is missing. Plus, even if it were present, necessity, they just want to go to the lake. And yeah, maybe they want to fish, but there's nothing in the facts that say they earn their livelihood by fishing in the lake, right? So they're not going to be able to claim a common law easement. They're not going to be able to claim the statutory easement. Once again, they're not landlocked. Plus, they're not using the road for ingress and egress in respect to their property. What about a prescriptive easement? Was their use open? Yeah. Was it actual? Yeah. Was it hostile? What do we think? Was it hostile? Well, it certainly started out, it wasn't clear that they had permission, and then it certainly became hostile because Bud and Charlie used the path even after Art complained. So if it wasn't hostile to begin with, it definitely is now. Continuous for 20 years. Bud used it for a really long time, and then Charlie came along. But if you do the math, the 20 years has been satisfied for both of them. Even if we weren't analyzing the question today, which of course is a long time from the original fact pattern, at the time the question was given, each of them had used the path for 20 years. So probably, well, and I want to mention the exclusivity. Because remember I said for adverse possession, it has to be strictly exclusive. It doesn't have to be so exclusive when it comes to a prescriptive easement. So we've got the two guys, Bud and Charlie, they're both using it. That's not a problem. And even if they shared the use with Art and then daughter, as I mentioned before, it's not going to be fatal. So what's the remedy? Once again, they can get either injunctive relief or money damages, whatever they want. And they probably want injunctive relief here because they want to keep going to the lake. If for any reason you say that there isn't a prescriptive easement, then the last thing you want to consider is this irrevocable license / easement by estoppel. They're really the same thing. There's a lot of case law that says they're really the same thing. If their initial use was permissive, it's not going to be hostile for the purposes of a prescriptive easement. But even if it was initially permissive, if they relied to their detriment, then that license, that's what the prescription would give them, a license, becomes irrevocable. And that irrevocable license is virtually identical to an easement, and so it's called an easement by estoppel. So what elements do we need? You don't need a writing. What you need to start with is some kind of license, privilege, permission, which maybe was true here. Facts are a little fuzzy. The facts don't specifically say that Art gave them permission, but maybe he did. Then remember that a license is revocable. And that's what daughter says. She says, hey, it was a license, it's revocable, I'm taken back. However, through that act of representation, it sounds a lot like the estoppel that you know from contracts, right? Is there anything that Art did that would amount to a representation to Bud and Charlie? Well, yes, in respect to Bud, because Art did let Bud clear the path. So that's a representation. It's not a promise. We're not talking about promissory estoppel. We're talking about equitable estoppel. And actual and justifiable reliance. You have to actually rely, which Bud and Charlie did. Bud cleared the path, and then Bud and Charlie continued to use it. And it has to be a reasonable reliance. For the reliance in this context to be reasonable, what you're going to be looking for is something that Art and then daughter knew or should have known about. Well, did they know that Bud and Charlie were using the path and that Bud had spent money clearing the path? Sure. And so, I'll get you in a second, Danny. So the reliance is probably reasonable. And if it's reasonable, then then you probably have a license that became irrevocable through estoppel, which then is treated like an easement. What, Danny, your question?
The fact of just clearing the overgrowth or laying down the road time.
Well, that helps too. they cleared the brush, they put the ties down, they're doing things that should show art at that time, that they were intending to continue to use the path. You're not going to be putting the ties down and clearing the brush if you're going to use it for one day, right?
Well, I guess what I meant though is just clearing the brush.
Oh.
Just manual labor, not really any monetary.
Oh, it's a good point. Oftentimes, your reliance is shown through the money you've expended, and putting the ties down certainly would bolster. And as I said, you should use all of the facts. Not only did they clear, they put the ties down. So that's a good point.
But that they're seeking equity. They just want to continue to use it.
Right. Good, and that's also a good point. You have to show the injustice. And the injustice is usually shown through reliance damages. Even if you're seeking injunctive relief, it's the reliance damages that shows the injustice.
So does it have to, do the monetary damages have to be tied to the use, or, like Danny said, also expenditures?
Either one or both. It helps if you have both. There's a, for those of you who had the Duke Manier casebook for property, there's a case Holbrook versus Taylor, and there was a mine, and the mine company had cleared a road to the mine, and then the owner of the parcel next door came along and built a house, used the road to haul materials to build the house, and spent a lot of money on the house, and then the mine closed down, and they closed off the road, and the court said, the expenditures there, you spent money. I can't remember now if they had expanded the road, spent money on building up the road, but they might have. I think they did. And they also spent money building the house and all of the above. So that's the type of fact pattern that you're looking for, which is, yeah, the railroad ties certainly help. They do, for sure. Any other questions on this question? Okay, then we'll take a short break. When we come back, I'll do the drawing, so anybody who came in late, make sure you put your ticket in, and then we're going to do the wills administration questions first, since there's a good chance that you might see them on the multiple choice.
That would be the Florida multiple choice?
Florida multiple choice, yep. Okay, let's kind of come back together. I think everybody's here. Looks, no, are we missing some? Before we jump back into the materials, announcement time. Okay, number one, is there anybody who didn't fill out the luncheon form? Everybody's filled them out. Danny, have you filled out? No, you're not? Okay. Okay. That's number, you have, oh. Because it's a free lunch. Hey, why not? We will, I don't know if Curleen already posted it. She's in the process of posting a couple of things. She'll post the do bring, don't bring. You can't bring much of anything, honestly. And so that's getting posted on the web course. And also, we will have earplugs for those who want them. I'll pass out some probably next week. If you're not going to lose them before you get to the exam, or you may want to wait. Plus, the career services people who will be in Tampa will bring some with them as well. Because remember, you cannot take any earplugs in that have connecting wires or anything like that. But you can wear earplugs, and I would highly recommend it because it can get kind of distracting in the room. Also, you bring as little as possible with you, other than the required ID, obviously. If you bring something, though, that you can't take into the room, there will be a table, probably in Concourse A, but we're getting that confirmed, that will be manned at least some points in the day by, again, the folks from Career Services. You can put your stuff under the table. If it's really valuable, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But in the past, we've made that available for you if you bring something like an outline that you can't take in. So that's all of that. Any questions before I do the drawing?
What is an outline that you can take in?
In your head. The outline in your head. And I was talking to Tamara on the break. That outline in your head, how am I going to write? That's part of the reason why I do this question, the property question. How am I going to write about easements? I already know how I'm going to write about easements. How am I going to write about a contract? We talked about that last week. How am I going to write about products liability? That kind of outline in your head is a really good idea. The more you have a game plan before you walk into the exam, the calmer you're going to be. And the calmer you are, the better job you're going to do it. So spend some time doing that. All right, I'm mixing these up as much as I can. For those of you who already have a hotel room, congratulations. For those of you who do not, let's see who we get now. Burton.
Oh, here.
Yes, Burton. All right, you're up. Stick your phone number, Burton, on there, and then give it back to me so I can give it to Curleen. All right, for those of you who haven't gotten a hotel room yet, you still have 2 chances, right? Next week, when we do family law and evidence and Florida Con Law. And then the final session. Now let me mention the final session now. And kind of explain what I'm going to do. The final session is on the Wednesday, the week before the exam. So we're getting close to the exam. And some people just want to put their heads down and just study. Some people actually like to come to these sessions. I do it for you, not for me, because honestly, sometimes they go on for a long time. Sometimes they go 6, 7 hours, and I keep going as long as I need to go. What I do is I do broad overview of as many subjects as I can cover in the time period allowed, based on your stamina and based on room availability. How many of you would be interested, and if you're not, no penalty, how many would be interested in that kind of session? Okay. If we have just 2 or 3 people, I do it for 2 or 3 people. I would ask you if you are interested in a session like that and there are particular subjects that you'd like to have an overview on, then let me know up front. Because what I usually do, without further direction from students, is I start with the MBE subjects because they're so foundational. And because we do have some people who are taking just MBE, so I start with MBE. But then if there are particular Florida subjects that we can do in overview form as well, I'm happy to do it. Now when I say overview form, I cannot, obviously in the limited time allotted, teach you everything you need to know about a particular subject. That's not the purpose. The purpose is for you, once again, to get these global approaches to the subjects in your head, because the more organized you are and the more able you are to see the steps you want to follow for any given subject, the better you're going to do on both parts of the exam. So you can be thinking ahead if you want to come to that session about which subjects you might want to have covered. If you don't want to come, perfectly understandable, because it is just a week before the exam. Okay, if there aren't any other questions, or if there are, fire away. If not, we're going to do some, but not all of the wills administration multiple choice. You'll notice also that in the materials you have some you have a handout on mortgages, and you also have a multiple choice set on mortgages. For those of you who have me for property, it's the same handout I gave you way back when. If you have it, you don't need it again. If you didn't keep it now. That handout has pretty much everything that you're going to need to know about mortgages. And if you had, as most people had, the Duke Manier book for property, it's great on a lot of things, but it's not on mortgages. So the chances are good that your mortgage coverage in your property class was not as complete as it maybe needs to be for the exam. They love to test mortgages. There are more and more mortgage questions in the MBE portion of the exam. So you really do want to master mortgages for MBE. And it shows up more than you might think in the essays in Florida. So do spend a little bit of time getting your head together about mortgages. Again, if you read through that packet and work through the questions, you should be in good shape. But what we're going to do now is selected wills administration and a couple of trust questions in the multiple choice. I'm not going to do them all because it would take us too long, number one, and number two, then it leaves you some additional questions to answer. The answer key is posted on the website. So I have analytical answers for all of these questions. All right, we are going to start with question number one, so you guys know the drill. Read the question, pick an answer, and we'll talk about it. Is your light on, Vanessa? Because it didn't seem to register you. Okay, well, I can swap out some of, because it definitely didn't register you.
It did now.
Oh, yep, just went now. Okay, do you want to?
I'm going to switch it up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is this really how they're going to be worded?
Oh.
That was terrible. I have to draw it out.
You have to draw it out, is right.
Draw it out. Like,
There's no choice on this one.
Yeah. Now, you know, I wrote these questions a while back when you were still using cute names. Now, I don't know what I would do, probably A, B, and C. But on the Florida exam, they don't follow the MBE rules, so you still could see something like this. I thought I counted 11. Anybody not vote? Oh, you're still working?
I have a clicker.
Oh, you can't vote if you don't have a clicker. Not a problem. But I'll show you how you want to draw it out.
how hard?
I don't think it's that hard, but hey. It is the type of question, though, that you have to be able to answer.
I tried to answer it without drawing it at first, and I got no chance.
All right, so let's see how we did. The answer is C, so not bad. Most of us got it right. But look at the drawing now. We go, hang on. Okay, so here we go. Dan is our decedent. And he's got 3 kids, Raccoon, Nancy, and Doc. Raccoon has Rocky. Nancy has Lil and McGill. Beatles songs, what can I tell you? I used to do themes, and this, when I wrote this, a lot of these questions came out at the same time period. They're Beatle themed. And it's appropriate, 50 years ago, kind of scary. Rocky, and then McGill and Lil and Gidgeon. Now, you got to cross out the people. Oh, I forgot Dakota, sorry. Who are dead. Dan's our decedent up at the top. Raccoon's dead, Nancy's dead, Doc's dead. We give one, let's back up before we do that. Okay, so we're in Florida. And we're talking about intestate distribution. And we know in Florida we have strict per stirpes, right? If it's strict per stirpes, you have to find the what generation? The root generation. The root generation is always the first generation after the common ancestor. Well, Dan is the common ancestor of Rocky, Nancy, and Doc. The root generation does not have to have any survivors. That's what makes it different from the UPC approach. It's the first generation after the common ancestors. Now, suppose that Dan didn't have any lineal descendants. So we're talking about collateral inheritance. The common ancestor would be Dan's parents. And so the root generation then would be Dan's brothers and sisters. So always look for the first generation after the common ancestor. We have 3 parts because you break it up according to the root generation. The number of individuals born into the root generation, 1, 2, 3, who either survive, well, none of them did, or who leave survivors. Well, Raccoon, Nancy, and Doc are all dead, but they each left survivors. So we have 3 parts. Rocky gets 1/3, and that next 1/3 is divided between McGill and Lil, and Gidgeon gets that 1/3. Dakota takes nothing because Gidgeon's still alive. Any questions? Make sure you draw the picture. Remember, I talked about drawing pictures in property. When it comes to intestate distribution, same thing, draw the pictures. Okay, question number 2. We're missing one person. Oh, there it goes. Okay. All right, so let's see how we did. And notice, by the way, that you all answered this question fairly quickly. I don't know if you got it right or wrong. We'll see in a minute. But the other question took you longer. Talked about it last week, talked about it the first class. Don't get so rigid in your approach to the questions that you don't give yourself the extra time that you needed for question 1. Because look, question 2 doesn't take you so long. So you've got to average out and get all your questions done. But if you skip over question 1 because it seems like it's going to take you too long, you miss an easy question. So see how we did here? And pretty good, not perfect, but pretty good. So we're dealing with half-bloods. And we have a specific Florida rule. Anytime we have a specific Florida rule that's different from the UPC, which it is, they're going to test it. So what do we do with half-bloods in Florida? If the inheritance is collateral, and I'll show it in the next picture, then the half-blood rule applies. If inheritance is lineal, the half-blood rule does not apply. So I'll show you what I mean here. So we got husband number 1 and mother. And they have a kid, Martha. Then husband number 1, he's out of the picture. Mother remarries husband number 2, 2 kids, Rita and Bonnie. Now, mother's dead, husband number 2 is dead. They're all out of the picture, and then Rita dies. She's our decedent. We are talking about collateral inheritance because Martha and Bonnie, they're not lineal descendants of Rita. They are sisters, half-sister in this case, but they're sisters of Rita. Now, what does it mean to be a whole blood versus a half-blood? Rita and Bonnie are whole blood because they share both a mother and a father. Bonnie and Martha are half-bloods because they share a mother but not a father. Half-bloods get half as much as whole bloods when inheritance is collateral. Easy in this one, 1/3, 2/3. But I'm going to give you a formula for those of you who like math. If you don't like math, you can maybe close your ears. But the formula works every time, and you may need it if you have a question that's more complicated than this one. So what you do is, when inheritance, again, is collateral, which it is here, you figure out how many people are related by the half-blood to the decedent and how many by the whole blood. For each person who is related by the half-blood, you give that person 1 portion. We would give Martha 1 portion here. For each person who is related by the whole blood, you give that person 2 portions. Bonnie gets a 2. Now you add up all the portions. 1 plus 2 is 3. And here's where the mathematically challenged don't like the formula. The total of the portions becomes the denominator of the fraction. And the portion you assign to the person becomes the numerator of the fraction. So once again, Martha got a 1, she's a half-blood. Bonnie got 2 because she's a whole blood. 1 plus 2 is 3. The 3 becomes the denominator, the bottom number. And Martha's 1 part becomes the numerator. She gets 1/3. And Bonnie's 2 parts becomes the numerator. She gets 2/3. If you use that formula in a more complicated question, it will get you the right answer every time. But I want to make one caution because they could test it in terms of lineal inheritance. Suppose, in this case, that Rita predeceased mother, and mother is our decedent. And so Martha and Bonnie are taking by intestate distribution from mother. Now, they are related by the half-blood, but they're each going to get how much? A half. Because we do not take the half-blood, whole blood into account when it's lineal inheritance. Any questions?
So what's the UPC distinction? Or how is this different?
UPC does not distinguish between whole and half-bloods even for collateral.
So they just get half. Okay.
Yeah. The half-blood rule is an old common law rule. Okay, we're going to skip number 3 just because it's a pretty easy question. Number 4. Okay, we're good. All right, let's see how we did. Pretty good, but not perfect. Interesting. Those of you who picked the wrong answer probably were getting tired. Look at the call of the question. It says, incorrect statement. Some of you probably picked the correct statement. So let's look at A, B, C, because they're all right. We're looking for revocation in Florida. Once again, we're going to highlight a Florida-specific rule. That's how they're going to test. So A says Billy can revoke by a subsequent writing that declares his intent. Of course he can. That's an express revocation. It's a correct statement. I think somebody picked it, but it's right. So that makes it the wrong answer here because the call of the question says incorrect. B, Billy may revoke by properly executing a subsequent will that contains inconsistent provisions. Sure, you can do that. That's revocation by inconsistency, no problem in Florida. C, which somebody else also picked, Billy may burn his will. Sure, you can. You can revoke by physical act in Florida. You have to have the intent, you have to do the act, or somebody is doing the act at your direction in your presence. You can rip it up, tear it up, burn it up, cancel it. If you burn, of course, you have to touch the dispositive provisions. But D says Billy may revoke by drawing a line through a portion. What you cannot do in Florida is revoke a part of a will by physical act. It's all or nothing when it comes to physical act in Florida. So that makes D the wrong statement, which means it's the right answer here. Tamar.
I have a question for you on number 3. I know we skipped it, but I know Florida doesn't recognize handwritten.
Oh, no, okay. Florida does not recognize a holographic will. Doesn't mean Florida does not recognize a handwritten will. Big difference. No. What makes a will holographic is it's all, at least the common law, all in the handwriting of the decedent, and it doesn't have witnesses. If you have a handwritten will that is executed with all will formalities, it doesn't matter if it's handwritten. So that was the trick that I put into number 3. Don't get tripped up by that particular rule. And it's the kind of thing they'll test. Holographic will, once again, a holographic will is a will that's all in handwriting but that lacks formalities, no witnesses usually. And Florida does not recognize a holographic will, even if it's valid in its state of execution. But a handwritten will that has observed all formalities is valid in Florida because it's executed with all will formalities. Will formalities, testator signs, or someone signs for the testator at the testator's direction and in the testator's presence, and the testator then either signs in the presence of the witnesses or acknowledges to the witnesses that the testator previously signed or somebody signed for him, right? You have to sign at the end, whatever the end means, which is a good question in Florida. And the witnesses have to sign in the presence of the testator and in the presence of each other. Those are the formalities you're looking for. Dean.
Wills and trusts, more than anything else, seems to be littered with all these, as long as before or after certain dates, October 2011.
Oh, yeah.
Do you need to worry about that?
Mostly not. There are a few things. When you get to termination of wills, of trust, and the question that I picked does have a termination component to it. When the trust was created does matter. When you deal with the anti-lapse statute, the trust anti-lapse statute, there are 3 different versions. Now, I can't imagine that they're going to try to cherry pick when it comes to those. I would learn the current version because, as I say, it's gone through so many. And by the way, not to make you nervous because you won't be tested on it, there's a statute that's a bill that's being proposed that would change that rule again. They keep fiddling with that stuff in Florida. I'm trying to think if there are any dates that I would be particularly concerned about. Other than if you can remember them in terms of termination, probably not. Probably not. It's something I would let go Yeah. Okay. Any other questions on 3 or 4? And again, you can pick up the analytical answers to all the questions that we're skipping, because I want to get this done by about 5, so we still have time for the essay. All right, we're going to jump forward to number 6. All right, let's see how we did. A topic that they like to test a lot, and of course we have 2 different lapse statutes in Florida, so there is room for confusion. Good but not perfect. A is the right answer here. So let's talk about the difference, first of all, between the wills and the trust anti-lapse statute, and then see how it plays out in this question, which of course is dealing with wills because it's talking about a testamentary gift. So the wills anti-lapse statute applies to any gift in a will that's not made in a testamentary trust. It's what I call an outright gift in a will. The trust anti-lapse statute, which is another thing they're trying to change again, the trust anti-lapse statute currently applies to all trusts, however, all interests and trusts, however the trust is created. It can be an inter vivos trust, it can be a testamentary trust. So the only time you use the wills anti-lapse statute, currently anyway, is when you have a gift in a will that's not in the context of a testamentary trust, which is what you have in this question. So what do you look for? You look for someone who predeceases the testator. If it's trust, obviously somebody who predeceases the distribution date. For a will, distribution date is the date, of course, of the testator's death. Beethoven predeceases our testator, so we do have a potential for lapse. The anti-lapse statute may step in and protect that interest if 2 things are present, if we're talking about the wills anti-lapse statute. First of all, your predeceased beneficiary has to be a descendant of the grandparent of the decedent. So anybody in the first 3 parentella. A lineal descendant of the decedent, a lineal descendant of the parents of the decedent, or a lineal descendant of the grandparents of the decedent. That's number 1. You have to have that relationship requirement for the wills anti-lapse statute. And then number two, that person who predeceased the decedent must leave lineal descendants who can step in and take the gift. So two things, the relationship requirement in respect to the grandparents and leaving lineal descendants who can step up and take the gift. If either one of those two is missing for the will's anti-lapse statute, that statute does not apply. Trust anti-lapse statute, there's no relationship requirement currently anyway. Anyone is protected if that person leaves lineal descendants. So we look at our answer choices here, and note also the structure of this question. It's not a question that you're likely to see on the MBE portion of the exam, because each of the answer choices adds facts. The current MBE style, all the facts are in the STEM or the fact pattern, and no additional facts are in answer choices. This is an older style question, but you can still see this style on the Florida exam. And remember, Will's administration, it's going to be on the Florida exam. So I'm giving you here questions in a number of cases that don't look like what you see on the MBE. I'm giving them to you on purpose, so you see these other styles. So in all of these cases, Beethoven predeceases Jude, predeceases our testator, and he is survived by children. So we've satisfied that second requirement, that there are lineal descendants. The question is, has he, Beethoven, satisfied the relationship requirement? And if Beethoven is Jude's brother, then of course he has, because they're both descendants of their parents, satisfies the grandparent requirement, obviously, which is what makes A right. They're not going to share if he's just his friend, no relationship. That's why B is wrong. And Julia, she's not getting anything, right? If the anti-lapse statute protects Beethoven's gifts, then Julia, who gets the residue, she doesn't get anything. So she's not going to share, which is what both C and D are talking about. Any questions, Dean?
I'm terrible with consanguinity, so cousin would satisfy that?
Mm-hmm. Because a cousin,
Grandparent.
yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Same grandparents, exactly right. So draw the family tree if you're, but stop and draw a family tree. When in doubt, draw a picture. Those pictures can really help you out. Any other questions about, yes?
So under the trust anti-lapse, if this was a trust,
Yeah.
B would be correct.
B would be correct under the trust. Actually, under the trust anti-lapse statute, B would be a better answer than A because you don't have to talk about relationship. But if I had written this as a trust anti-lapse statute question, I probably wouldn't have given A. I'd do something else there. I can't promise you on the exam that they would be that clear and concise because they're not with these Florida questions. But the key is no relationship requirement, which is indeed what B is saying, which is why B would even be better than A if this had been a trust question.
When I missed what you said about the trust, we don't need the relationship, but we still need the lineal.
Yeah, somebody has to step in and take the gift for you. Can't be protected unless somebody else can take for you. And that somebody else must be a lineal descendant. Your collateral heirs, your brothers and sisters, parents, whatever, they can't take your gift for you under the anti-lapse statute. Lineal only. Okay, any other questions? Frequently tested topics, so make sure that you can handle it. Number 7. We're missing somebody here? So, you all think you voted? Oh, okay. Okay, now we're good. Okay. All right. Ademption is the issue here. They like ademption. It's easy to test. Now, in respect to Florida, there is one little quirk in Florida. Hard to test, honestly, in multiple choice, but just be aware of it. Generally, ademption has nothing to do with intent. The property's there or it's not there. Remembering, of course, that ademption occurs when property that's devised, so we have to have a will, is no longer in the estate at the time of the testator's death. In most jurisdictions, and certainly UPC, intent has no effect on ademption. The property's there or it's not. Florida does follow a minority rule in saying that intent can be taken into account. Once again, hard to test in multiple choice, but maybe it could show up in an essay. And so just remember that you can take intent into account in Florida. Now, there are a bunch of exceptions to the ademption rule in Florida. And you know, they're not going to test the basic rule. They're going to test the exceptions. And that's what this question is testing. It's a lot of exceptions to memorize, but you can kind of get the gist of them. It'll help you with questions like this by focusing on what those exceptions do. So, for example, if you have a contract for the sale of property, and part of the proceeds are paid before the seller dies, but not all of them, then what you're going to have is you're going to go pro tanto. Anything that's still outstanding will go to the beneficiary. Anything that's already paid, it's in the general estate and you can't trace it. Same thing with insurance. If part of the proceeds from insurance, if the house burns down, if part have been paid, whatever's already been paid, you can't trace it. But anything that's still due can go to the beneficiary. Same thing with eminent domain. Part of the eminent domain payment's been made, it's gone. Whatever's outstanding goes to the beneficiary. If you have property that's been devised to a beneficiary, and that's what C is saying. Oops, I didn't put our chart up, did I? We didn't do so well here. If the property has been sold, it's not in the estate. It looks like it's been deemed, and that's why you were thinking about a number of you. The exception says if the property's been sold by the guardian for the care of the decedent during the decedent's lifetime, then you turn the specific devise into a general legacy equivalent to the net sale proceeds. Not the wholesale, but the net sale proceeds. But there is even an exception to this exception, because we're assuming that if you have a guardian, that not assuming, if you have a guardian, the person's already been declared incompetent. If the person is later declared competent and remains competent for 1 year, then this exception doesn't apply. Because if you're competent for a year, you can change your will. It's the kind of stuff they do like to test. I've seen this particular point tested.
So C is the correct answer?
C is the right answer here, yes. Okay. Any questions on that one? Because like I say, and remember, for ademption, you're talking about specific devices. If you have a general device, ademption's not an issue. Okay, number 12. We're going to jump forward a little bit to number 12. We're going to do a little bit of the really dry stuff now. Okay, we've got it. I say it's the really dry stuff, and you probably didn't cover this probate process stuff in your wills and trust class, whoever you had, because it is really boring. But you have to know it, because they will test it. And interesting, the answer is all of the above. So let's look at the statements. Okay, you could, yeah. It's the kind of stuff I hate to tell you, you should know. So A says, probate proceedings are commenced in the county in which the decedent was a resident at the time of his death. Yes, if your decedent is a resident, that's where you go. If your decedent is a non-resident, which is B, then any county in which the decedent owned property. And then if there is no property, then C is where you go. Any county in which there is a debtor of the decedent. So they're all correct.
I wasn't sure of C, but I'm sure of A and B. So if you had other, like, you know how they do 1
Yeah.
and 2 and 2,
Right.
then I would probably.
Yeah, and I could have made it really hard, and I could have done that. All three are correct, though. This one I made an easy question. Go back and take a look at your outline, because chances are slim that you covered this stuff in wills and trusts, but is it testable? Yes, it is. Any other questions on this one? Okay, number 14 will be the last one. There are some trust questions in here that you can play with, but we'll cover a lot of the trust issues in the trust essay. So number 14. Okay, you kind of went, close my eyes and point. You know, you got to pick something. We got a 25% chance of getting it right. If you weren't real comfortable with these last two questions, you got to review that stuff, because remember, there's a good chance that oh shoot, now we're not going to get the right one. Well, okay. I wanted to show and I didn't look to see on the graph. Okay, well, we'll never know how you did. We'll pretend you all got the right answer. The right answer on this one is B, the surviving spouse. So let's talk about what happens. If you have an intestate estate, there's no will, so nobody has been named as the personal representative. The surviving spouse is the first choice. If there is no surviving spouse, or the surviving spouse declines, then you go to the person selected by a majority in interest. Now, when we talk about majority in interest, we're not talking about the number of people. We're talking about interest in the estate itself. So who's going to take the most? And if the person selected by a majority in interest doesn't want to serve, or they can't get together and pick somebody, then you go to the heir of the nearest degree of kinship. Danny?
If the majority of interest of the heirs were minority children, would that then go to the heir of kinship?
Yeah, if they were kids, they wouldn't be able to pick, and so then you probably would have to go to the nearest degree of kinship. Yep. Now, if it is a testate estate, so you have a will. I don't have a question on it, but always good to review. Who should be the first pick as the personal representative?
What was the question again?
If there's a testate estate, there is a will, the first pick is going to be whoever what? Named in the will, right? Because if your testator goes through the trouble of picking somebody, then that's the first choice. If that person isn't able to serve, doesn't want to serve, whatever, then once again, you go to the person selected by the majority in interest, this time not of the heirs, but of the beneficiaries under the will. And then if they can't agree, or that person doesn't want to serve, then anybody who is a devisee under the will. Question?
Yes, the person that's, you said the person selected by a majority of, so you're saying out of all the people that could take, it's
The majority, yeah, right. The majority in interest, and the difference is this. Suppose that you have 15 people who could take by intestate distribution. It's not that you need 8 to agree. You need whoever has 51% of the interest. So if you have 15 people, some people may have a greater share than others. So that's the key there. And whether it's testate or intestate. Okay, unless you really need a break, I know we've been going for another hour. I'd kind of like to just get started on trust because if we take a break, it'll take us longer to get out of here. And I am sensitive about your time. So if you need to step out, by all means. Once again, the answers are posted, so you can pull them down. If you have any trouble, then let us know next week, but you should be able to get the answers to the questions. All right, so now with the trust question, please take some time, once again, to read it briefly. We are not, and again, in the interest of time, we're not going to do the pro-rep part of it. We're just going to do the trust part, not to diminish the importance of the pro-rep, but just, again, we're kind of limited in time. So take a few minutes, and then we'll see what we have. And yes, please, we still have plenty of pizza if anybody's hungry. I'm going to collect these because we're done. Yep, thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, there's a bit of pepperoni left. I don't know what's in this one. Cheese. Thanks, Danny. Got them? Okay. Oops. I got one more. Thanks. Thank you. You can just...
I love the pizza grease on
I won't be the first or the last time. Thanks. Okay, yeah. As Dean walks out the room, yeah, sorry, but let's go ahead and get started with the question. So in 1992, Susan transfers $400,000 to Ted and Tammy as trustees under a written irrevocable trust agreement. Well, we know we're in trust land, right? Because it tells us we have a trust. It says it's written, it's irrevocable, it's a trust. Note that this is an older question, and it was written at a time, although my answer is according to current law, written at a time when trusts were presumed to be irrevocable. You know today, and it kind of goes back to Dean's question, for the past few years, well, it's more like 6 or 7 years now, since the new trust code was enacted, that trusts are presumed to be revocable in Florida rather than irrevocable. So there's a major shift in how we view trust law. If they don't tell you, it's going to be irrevocable unless they give you facts that make it very clear that it's irrevocable.
It's going to be irrevocable.
Say that very carefully. Irrevocable means you can take it back. Trusts are presumed to be revocable in Florida today unless you have evidence to the contrary. Mike.
So if this was now the way it was written, this would be irrevocable?
It would still be irrevocable because it tells you it's irrevocable. But you need something that clear. Otherwise, you're going to have a revocable trust. And of course, that makes a big difference because if a trust is revocable, a couple of things that you need to keep in mind about the trust. Number one, it's subject to the settlor's creditors during the settlor's life. If it's revocable, it's completely subject to the creditors of the settlor and under the control of the settlor because it's revocable. And really importantly, if you have a revocable trust in Florida today that has what we call testamentary aspects, which means it's designed to transfer property at or after the death of the settlor, it must be executed with all will formalities. So they don't really tell you here. It doesn't matter because it's an irrevocable trust, but be on the lookout for that issue because it's highly testable. Once again, a revocable trust in Florida, at least so long as it has testamentary aspects, and they always do, must be executed with full will formalities. So the agreement, and stop for a second, Susan's our settlor, right? Not too difficult. $400,000, that's your trust race, right? Because trust race can be real property, personal property, tangible, intangible. And Ted and Tammy are the trustees. The agreement provided that the income of the trust was payable to Ted for 10 years. Do we care? No, we don't. You can be both a trustee and a beneficiary as long as you are not the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. And while Ted does get the income by himself for 10 years, so he is the sole beneficiary during that time period, we have remainder interest in other individuals. It's a place where I see people getting tripped up frequently. The split, the required split between legal and equitable is still preserved here because of the future interests. So even though Ted is the sole beneficiary for a period of time, because there are other beneficiaries who will take later, the fact that he is the trustee and the beneficiary at one point in time, not fatal. Now, after 10 years, the trust was to terminate and the assets are to be distributed as follows. 1/4 share to Tammy. Okay, well, that's okay, because she can be a beneficiary. But, only if she survives Ted. We have a condition precedent to her ability to take, which will become important here, because she is going to predecease. And remember also, for your lapse statute, whether anti-lapse statute, whether it's the wills or the trust anti-lapse statute, if the document, the will or the trust, provides otherwise, then the anti-lapse statute doesn't apply. And what does it mean? What are you going to look for in the fact pattern to see that the document provides otherwise? An express condition of survivorship. So anytime you see that express condition of survivorship, the anti-lapse statute will not apply. 1/4 share to Bob. Okay, well, that looks good. A little word of advice to you. If you're stuck, if you get a trust question, or Will's question for that matter, and you've got a Bob, just give everything to Bob. Bob always gets everything. You'll see. He does. So when in doubt, give it to Bob. Believe me, that rule works. 1/4 share to be distributed for religious purposes. Anybody got a problem with that?
Yes.
Yeah, well, think again. Religious purposes, it looks really vague, right? But by statute in Florida under the current trust code, yeah. Who can make that decision? The court. Used to be the trustee could, but under the current trust code, the court can pick an appropriate religious organization. And then a 1/4 share to be distributed equally among my friends. Oh, now we have to worry about indefinite beneficiaries. But there's a statute that's about 3 or 4 years old now that says that if you have a gift that is otherwise indefinite, the trustee can pick. And if the trustee picks within a reasonable time, that choice will be upheld. If the trustee doesn't pick within a reasonable time, whatever that would be, then the gift fails. So that's a change from the time this question was written. All right, so now Susan dies in 1995. She leaves her entire estate to Bob. What did I tell you? Bob's going to get everything. Well, not everything, but he gets a lot. Tammy dies in 1997. And she obviously didn't survive Ted. So she's out of luck here. After her death, Ted maintained a policy of investments of the trust assets consisting of 90% corporate bonds and 10% stocks. Anybody know what that fact is doing there?
Prudent investor.
Prudent investor, because what has he done? If he puts everything into corporate bonds, got to put on your business entity's hat. What is a corporate, well, not today, but at least at the time this question was written, what does a corporate bond usually spin off? Income, interest, which goes to the current beneficiary, right? It doesn't grow the stock. And so why did Ted put everything, or almost everything, into corporate bonds? Because he was getting the interest. So he didn't diversify. He did not observe his duty to treat all beneficiaries impartially, because he benefited himself and not other beneficiaries. It's not self-dealing. Yeah, it's because he
minimized the risk
yeah.
to the portfolio.
He did minimize the risk for his benefit. So it's a breach of the duty of diversification, number one, and number two, impartiality. It's not technically self-dealing, however. But know those trustee duties, because they do love to test them. It's another thing that wills and trust classes tend to give a little bit of short shrift to, because you run out of time. Make sure you go back and review trustee duties. Okay, Bob comes to you for advice. So you're advising Bob the bandit. Can Bob have the trust declared invalid? So the first thing that we're going to do is look at the validity of the trust. If they ask you questions in a particular order, answer them in the order they asked them. Real simple. So we're going to look at the validity of the trust first. Second, can Bob have Ted removed as trustee? Question number 2. C, if the trust is not declared invalid, how will the trust assets be distributed? That's number 3. And of course, number 4, which is the second question, is the proposed fee arrangement. There is, of course, an explanation in the packet, but in the interest of time, we won't take the pro-rep questions. So let's take a look at our 4 issues. First is the validity of the trust. And the nice thing about a trust question is all trust questions follow the same basic arc again. First thing you have to do is establish whether the trust has been properly created. Then you're going to construe the trust provisions, talk about lapse, talk about redemption if you need to, and trustee duties. And then the final thing you'll do is terminate the trust. So if you can kind of keep that game plan in mind, your trust question is already structured for you. So what do we need for a valid trust? You need the settlor. You need the trustee. You need the trust race. ascertainable beneficiaries. And I mentioned resulting trust. We'll come back to that. Of course, a resulting trust is not a true trust, but if a gift in a trust fails, then you're going to have a resulting trust in favor of the settlor.
You need, I think the lectures, whenever they went over like the trust essay, you said something about intent.
Yeah, the intent, I kind of combine it with the settlor, but yes. The settlor has to intend to create a trust. And what you can't have is precatory language. It has to be mandatory language, which is probably what they talked about. So you can't say it's my wish or my desire that the trustee do such and such. The trustee must do something. That oftentimes comes up in construction of the trust terms, but it's not wrong to include intent here. And of course, the other thing that I don't have listed here that sometimes you have to consider is the writing requirement. They told you it's in writing, we're done with that issue. But make sure that you spend some time looking at writing requirements, because if you have a trust that involves land, then you have to have a writing, right? If it's an oral trust of personal property, if it's irrevocable, you can prove that oral trust of personal property by clear and convincing evidence. Now, today, with this presumption of revocability, however, if you have a revocable oral trust, you're going to have to put it in writing and satisfy the will's requirements, the will's formalities requirements. You had a question?
No,
So kind of review those requirements, because they could come into play. They don't in this question. So we're going to start with our settlor. It's Susan. She clearly had the intent, so if you want to add the intent in, that's certainly relevant. But it's not an issue here. Would I mention it? Yes. I wouldn't just jump over the element. I'd show I know the elements, but I wouldn't spend any time talking about it. Trustee. You got to have that split between legal and equitable ownership, but as we just discussed, and notice I've given you a bunch of statutory citations here. Unless they help you remember the rules, feel free to ignore them. They're there to show you the new trust code. It's really not that new anymore, but the principles are the key. So we have a split. Susan transfers legal title to Ted and Tammy as co-trustees. And even though we have both of them with a potential beneficial interest, we're still okay on our split because there are other beneficiaries. And what happens after Tammy dies and Ted becomes the sole trustee? It depends in part on the trust document. He can continue to be the sole trustee here because he's not the sole beneficiary, and the court really doesn't have to name a replacement trustee, although it can. The only time the court must fill the vacancy is if the trust document requires the two trustees. But can I tell you, don't ever draft a trust document with just two trustees. Why?
they split on the decision.
Yeah, one or three. If you want multiple trustees, and you might, don't do two. That's stupid, because then they have to agree on everything, which they won't do. Okay. So we already talked about that. We'll go past it, and we're going to go to the trust race. $400,000. Not much to say there. Maybe you don't have an identifiable trust race, or maybe it's some kind of expectancy. There are a few things that can come up, but usually on this exam, the trust race is not going to be the issue. So once again, say we have the race, and that's all we need. Where could it come up? I actually do want to give you a couple of caveats there, not raised by this question. If you have an unfunded trust, remember that the trust, generally speaking, has to be funded. But we have two major places by statute, again in Florida, where you can have a trust unfunded during the life of the settlor. Pour-over trust, life insurance trust. And they tested life insurance trust not too long ago. I think the last time they had a trust question, well, actually, I think this last one, if I'm remembering correctly, had a life insurance trust. By statute, the life insurance trust can be funded solely by the proceeds of the life insurance on the death of the settlor. And the pour-over trust can be funded during the life of the settlor, but doesn't have to be. And let me point out a really important distinction, which I see a lot of people make errors on. Difference between a testamentary trust and a pour-over trust. Now get the vocabulary right, because it'll make a difference in your point total. A testamentary trust is a trust that's created in a will. And sometimes they test it that way. But the whole trust has to be created in the will. A pour-over trust exists when you have two documents. You have a trust document and you have the will. And the will pours assets into the pour-over trust. But you have to have two separate documents for pour-over. If the will is created, the trust is created in the will, it's testamentary. It's not pour-over. Now, what about a pour-over trust? Remember, the trust has to be created before or concurrently with the execution of the will. The will has to refer to the trust, and the reference has to be sufficient so that the trust can be identified. If you have that trust that's clearly identified and created either concurrently with or prior to the execution of the will, it can be funded, it can remain unfunded. It's usually revocable, and it can be changed any time during the settlor's lifetime. So make that distinction, and once again, that's the only time that you're probably going to have to worry about the trust race. Beneficiaries, of course, are important. All right, we need, for a private trust, we need ascertainable beneficiaries. And so we start with Ted and Bob. They're ascertainable, we know who they are, and there isn't an issue. And we got Tammy. Well, at the time that Susan executed the trust, Tammy was alive, ascertainable. So the fact that she died affects her gift, but it doesn't affect ascertainable beneficiaries. Religious purposes. Once again, some of you are saying, it's too vague. It is a little vague, but first of all, at the time this particular question was written, case law said that you can fix the problem. By statute now, you can fix the problem. It is not the same thing as cypre, so don't write cypre right here. What's the difference? Here we have a general gift for charitable purposes with no particular beneficiary named. And of course, it's religious purposes here. For a charitable trust, you either name the charity or it's vague. You can't not name specific individuals for a charitable trust. You can name the charity, but you can't name specific individuals. So what Susan did here is just say, well, something religious. Under the current statute, the court can choose an appropriate charity trying to divine the intent of the settlor. It's not cypre, because cypre applies if you have a beneficiary named, a charitable beneficiary named, and either that charitable beneficiary is no longer in existence or the purpose for which the money is directed can't be carried out. There's a case that I teach in my Wills and Trust class. A gift was made to a hospital to build a new building for particular disease control. I can't remember what the disease was. It wasn't enough money to build a whole building. And so the hospital said, well, hey, can we just take a wing in our existing building and rename it and make it a wing for, I think it was some kind of children's disease. That would be cypre, because you have a charity named and a purpose named. The purpose can't be carried out. And so the court then could pick a purpose that is as close as possible. But here, there's no purpose. Well, there's a general purpose. There's no charity named in the first place. It's not cypre. Now, what about my friends? Used to be, definitely too vague. Because leaving Facebook aside, we have to hope that we have a lot of friends, and you can't necessarily identify who all your friends are. Now, you know, you can, through Facebook, maybe you can. But at the time the question was written, my friends would be too vague. Not so today. And also I want to caution, if you have a class gift, which this is, my friends, you can use extrinsic evidence to prove the class. There's another question which I use sometime in which the gift was to the jocks I saw at my 20th high school reunion. I'm not making this up. This is the question, and this is exactly how it was phrased. Okay, we don't know specifically who they were, but you can use extrinsic evidence. You can use the guest list for the reunion. You can use photos from the reunion. You can use emails and letters and whatever else they exchanged. There are ways that you could figure out who the settlor saw. But here you can't even figure out who my friends are. So under the current rule, I'm sorry, right there. If you have a gift to a class that isn't defined specifically enough, the trustee is given the power, and this is the trustee who makes the choice here. The trustee is given a power, it's like a power of appointment, statutory power of appointment, to choose members of the class to receive the gift. And if the trustee acts, again, within a reasonable time, whatever reasonable under that fact pattern, the gift will be upheld. If the trustee doesn't pick anybody within a reasonable time, the gift fails, and that's when we have a resulting trust in favor of the settlor's estate. And remember, with the resulting trust, it's not a real trust. It's just a fiction we use to send the property back to the settlor's estate, or it could be with a will to the testator's estate. Resulting trust always throws the property backwards, going back to the person who attempted to create a gift. A constructive trust pushes the property forward to the third person who should have gotten it, but for the fraud or whatever else that occurred that prevented the person from getting it. So use the proper terms there again. Constructive trust, push the property forward, oftentimes based on fraud, although not always fraud, but always based on unjust enrichment. Resulting trust, throw the property back to the person who tried to create the gift in the first place. Okay. So we have a valid trust. Next question that they asked is, can we remove Ted? Normally, if they didn't ask about removing Ted, you'd go to the next step, which is how do we construe the provisions and how do we distribute the property. But to get that aspect of trustee duties in, they throw in removal of Ted. So first off, you want to know what court has jurisdiction. You can throw those little jurisdictional things in. You pick up points. And who has standing, which actually is more important now under the current law than it was at the time this question was written. Grounds for removal, and then do we need a replacement trustee? So let's start first with that little jurisdictional thing. What kind of court? And I actually didn't write it there, but probate always goes into the circuit court. So I should have said circuit court. And, whoops, I'm sorry. That went too fast. Any beneficiary can seek removal of the trustee if the trustee has breached the trustee's fiduciary duty. The court may also remove the trustee. And remember, if the settlor is alive and you have a revocable trust, the settlor can remove the trustee too. So Bob, who's a remainder beneficiary, has standing to have Ted removed. He does not have to be a qualified beneficiary. To terminate an irrevocable trust, which is what we have in this case, in most situations, the beneficiary has to be a qualified beneficiary. And we'll talk about that later. But here, any beneficiary can seek removal of a trustee. Now, what are we going to remove Ted for? We start with the prudent investor, which is going to be the source of several breaches of fiduciary duty here. A trustee, of course, has to be a prudent investor. So as a prudent investor, what does he have to do? First thing is he has to diversify. Unless, of course, the trust document directs otherwise. And there's one question that I use from time to time in which the settlor wanted all of his assets to be placed in one investment and directed the trustee to do so. If the settlor says, put them all in one basket, then you don't have to diversify. And if the trustee believes it's in the best interest of the trustee may also avoid diversification. But if the trustee thinks that non-diversification is the way to go, the trustee should always anyway go to court and get the court's approval so that the beneficiaries then can't claim it's a breach of fiduciary duty. So Ted clearly failed to diversify here. He put almost everything into bonds. Mike?
That duty can be delegated to like
Yes.
financial company.
Yeah, good point. Not raised by these facts, but can a trustee delegate a duty? Once upon a time, the answer was no. Common law, you couldn't delegate any duties, and it created problems. A case I used to teach when I was using a different case book, there was a woman who was named as trustee, and she knew she didn't have the financial ability. So she hired a financial planner. She delegated her duty. The court said it's a breach. But that makes no sense. So in Florida, yes, you can delegate your duty to a financial planner or somebody else, but you never give up the duty, which means then that you have to supervise. You have to use due care in choosing your delegatee, and you must supervise your delegatee. But Ted didn't delegate. He just failed to diversify, and so he has breached his fiduciary duty, clearly didn't get court approval or beneficiary approval. If the trustee does something that would be a breach of fiduciary duty, but it's in the best interest of the beneficiaries and they ratify, then there's no breach. So that's breach number one. Breach number two, impartiality. And they do like to test both of these because they're easy to test. So be on the lookout for them. And the duty of impartiality again says that the trustee must treat all beneficiaries equally, or as equally as possible under the circumstances. Clearly, Ted didn't do that here because he maximized the income for his own benefit as the income beneficiary, and possibly to the detriment of the principal, which would go to the remainder beneficiaries. So Ted, he's in trouble. Can he be removed? Sure he can. And do we need to have a replacement trustee? Now, everybody, at least one time in a trust answer, is going to write, but a trust will not fail for want of a trustee. Everybody writes it, whether it's relevant or not. It's sort of relevant here, but not really. The fact of the matter is, if we remove Ted, the court's going to step in and replace somebody else. The only time that the court would let a trust fail for lack of a trustee is if the settlor says, I want this one person and nobody else. Could happen. And sometimes the trust document will actually specify one and only one trustee. But remember again, if you have multiple trustees and one is removed or dies or declines to serve further, the court doesn't have to fill that position unless the document requires it. So Bob does have standing, and Ted breached his duty, and so Bob can ask the Ted to kick Ted out and replace him. Finally, we distribute the assets. Income to Ted for 10 years, quarter share to Tammy, quarter share to Bob, quarter share for religious purposes, and quarter share to my friends. Well, we're really kind of summarizing here because most of what we talked about was already discussed when we determined that we had ascertainable beneficiaries. So you can kind of go through this part more quickly. You still want to address it because of the way they posed the questions in the call of the question. But again, you can refer to your discussion before. So Ted, does he get his income? Yes, he does. The fact that he breached his fiduciary duty does not strip him of his beneficial interest, unless the trust document provides otherwise, and it clearly did not. So even though he can be removed as trustee, he can get the income for 10 years. Quarter share to Tammy. Tammy didn't survive Ted, and that was an express condition precedent to her ability to take her gift. And of course, she isn't even given survivors here. So the anti-lapse statute wouldn't protect her anyway. But even if they said she's survived by whoever, and it's a trust, so we don't need a relationship requirement, we have an express condition of survivorship in the document, which means the gift is outside the scope of the anti-lapse statute. What happens to Tammy's interest? It fails. Resulting trust rises in favor of Susan's estate. And who did she devise all of her property to? Bob the bandit. Okay, so Ted gets the income for 10 years, but now Bob is going to get Tammy's quarter interest. And of course, he gets his quarter interest, so now he has half. And of course, as the question was originally written, he got 3/4. Now he only gets half. But he's still doing well. What about religious purposes? As we already said, the court can name a religious institution that is within the court's understanding, an institution that would have been within Susan's intent. And finally, as we said with my friends, Ted or the replacement trustee, if we're dealing now with a replacement trustee, can step in and pick some friends. And as long as he does so within a reasonable time, they take. If he doesn't, resulting trust, and then of course then Bob does get 75%. So my conclusion, Ted gets the income, and at the end of 10 years, the religious purpose and the friends selected by Ted, and then Bob gets everything. Any questions? Okay. What we don't have in this question, and I even hesitate to raise the issue, is termination of irrevocable trust. Now, did I include that with this packet? I have a handy-dandy little slide.
How do you feel about modification as well?
Well, modification or termination go together. And I always say termination, and I really shouldn't, because it's modification or termination. We have your email addresses. I can send it to you. I don't know if I can find it real fast. Let's see if I can find it real fast. Yeah. Do the best you can. They love to test this particular issue. So having some knowledge isn't a bad thing. Oh, wrong chapter. Let's try. Yep. Ah, here we go. All right. It's a little chart here. There's a lot of information, and I keep adding information because there's really a whole lot that's going on. But let me tell you what you can do, and we can send this to you if you are interested. You want to get some general understanding. What kinds of termination are available, what the grounds are, who has the power to seek it, the date of the trust, and this goes back to Dean's question, because here date of the trust does kind of matter, and any limitations. So, and we are talking about termination or modification of an irrevocable trust. A trust that starts out life as irrevocable, like in the question we just did, or a revocable inter vivos trust that becomes irrevocable when the settlor dies. Because if the trust is irrevocable during the settlor's life, it is automatically irrevocable after the settlor dies, plain and simple. So we have judicial, we're going to see we have non-judicial, we've got common law, and then we have uneconomical trust, basic categories. If you can say something intelligent, at least that we have some categories, it's getting you points, right? The amount of detail that we have here and some of the twists and turns with the rule against perpetuities, you might choose to just tune out. But it's, you know, you can look at the information. So if we're talking about judicial termination, you must go to court. And there are two kinds. One dealing with the trust purpose that's fulfilled or unanticipated events that occur. Trust purpose is fulfilled. Suppose that someone has set up a trust for you to pay for your law school costs. You're saying, I wish, right? You finish law school, trust purpose has been fulfilled, right? What's the point of keeping the trust any longer? Because you're done with law school. Unanticipated events, oftentimes it's when somebody gets really sick and you need money for medical care. Now, who can terminate the trust? Trustee or a qualified beneficiary. A qualified beneficiary is somebody who's taking the beneficial interest right now. That's your current qualified beneficiary. The person who will take when the current beneficiary steps aside or dies or whatever, which is if you have a life estate followed by another life estate, that person is your intermediate beneficiary. And then your first line remainder beneficiary, the person who will take when the trust is terminated. That's your qualified beneficiary. I wouldn't worry too much about the details there because it's a hard thing to test. So just say qualified beneficiary and you got points. We don't care about the date of the trust and there are no limitations. The trust, if the court needs to step in to terminate or modify the trust in those circumstances, it can. The next is best interests of the beneficiaries. A little bit like the other one. Once again, trustee or qualified beneficiary. Here's where it has to be a trust created after that date. It's the effective date of the statute. Now, if you want me to explain, I can, but most people you're going to start to get cross-eyed in how it works. So I'll leave it up there. When we're done, if anybody wants some explanations there, I can give it. Notice, a spendthrift provision which would prevent termination of a trust at common law may be considered, but it's not dispositive in any of these categories except for common law termination, which goes there. Non-judicial termination occurs unanimous consent of the trustee and all qualified beneficiaries after the death of the settlor. So you have to wait till the settlor dies for non-judicial termination, and everybody has to agree, which is different from common law termination because the trustee doesn't participate in common law termination. So trustee and qualified beneficiaries, same date because it was created by the statute, and a different, if you look at, and this is why I say you're going to get cross-eyed, they phrased it differently. The bottom line is if you're drafting and you want to prevent judicial or non-judicial termination, then just say it. And make sure that all of the interests satisfy the 90-year rule against perpetuity. Not the 360-year rule that applies to trusts, but the shorter 90-year. Remember, of course, for any interest created in a trust today, after the effective date of that statute, 360 years, so it means rule against perpetuities, forget about it. Unless you're going to live that long, and good luck to you if you are. Common law termination. We recognize in the statute expressly recognizes and includes common law termination. Now, notice, all beneficiaries after the death of the settlor or with the settlor's consent while the settlor is still alive. Who's left out of that picture? Trustee. All the beneficiaries can get together under the common law. But there's no termination if there is a purpose left to be served, and this time, spendthrift provision can prevent termination, common law termination, and age limitation is the other thing you look for there. Finally, the uneconomic trust, two kinds, very similar. This one was a leftover from the old statute. So if the trust corpus falls below $50,000, the trustee by himself can seek termination of the trust. Because if it costs more to administer the trust than it's going to spin off in income, there's no point. And if you have a spendthrift provision, once again, it's not dispositive unless the trust document says it is. And then finally, the new statute also has a provision without the $50,000 limit, but it's the same idea. If it costs more to administer the trust than it would spin off in terms of income, then the court can terminate by application of the trustee or a qualified beneficiary. So we'll send this around to you, should have included it in the packet. Basic concepts, good thing to have a handle on because it's very testable. How much of this detail you cram into your brain, that's another thing. I'm not sure I would memorize the whole chart, honestly. But general ideas so you can say something intelligent, probably a good idea. Dean?
Qualified is just the people that are currently
It's
at
those.
principal income, right?
It's the three. Yeah, it's the three. The one who gets it right now, the estate that immediately follows, and then the one that gets it when the trust is terminated. That's what makes a qualified beneficiary. Yeah,
So
they're
that's
the
qualified.
remainder that they would be the first line remainder beneficiary. Yes, so it's any one of those three is a qualified beneficiary.
So then who would you add in to make all beneficiaries versus
Good question. Most people are going to fall into one of those three categories. An unborn beneficiary is not a qualified beneficiary. You have to be alive to be a qualified beneficiary. So that's usually who is not. But you could possibly, if you have a gift that's spread out over enough life estates, you might have somebody in the middle who's not a qualified beneficiary.
Now, the sample example we went through, it's sort of like that's how to create and set up a trust. So it seems like one way they could test it, and another way seems to be testing operation of it.
Yeah.
So would they attack it from getting into spendthrifts and creditor access and that sort of?
Right. As spendthrift provisions, you know, the portion that I called trust operation, you're going to first determine whether the trust has been properly created. Sometimes, though, they tell you so-and-so executed a valid trust document, so you can kind of fast forward. But you construe the provisions, and a spendthrift provision is certainly one that comes up a lot. And remember the three exceptions that we have in Florida for spendthrift provisions. If you provide services to protect a beneficiary's interest in the trust, an attorney who defends a beneficiary's interest in the trust can attack the trust. That's one. Two, a spouse or a child for alimony or child support, but only as a last resort. You have to exhaust your traditional methods, garnishing wages, etc. And the third category is claims of the state or federal government, which might be taxes, certainly could be taxes, but also apparently was designed to take into account Medicare, Medicaid, those kinds of claims. What's left out that used to be an exception in Florida is someone who provides necessary items. We used to have a common law exception if you provided necessary items, food, clothing, shelter. You cannot, apparently not. Florida, it's not entirely clear in Florida, but Florida statute is modeled after the Uniform Trust Code, and there are comments to the Uniform Trust Code that make it clear that they left that out. Why did they leave it out? Because they said most of those claims come through Medicaid, Medicare anyway. So yeah, the answer, that's a long-winded answer to your question, but yes, spendthrift provisions would come into that part of the analysis. And they love to test spendthrift provisions. That's a frequent flyer.
So the settler gets into a little trouble, and then it starts talking about
The beneficiary gets into trouble.
Yes, and what they can attack and whatnot. It's a mandatory,
Right.
discretionary.
Right. Gets into trouble, or there's a question that I used sometime in which one of the beneficiaries wanted to assign her interest to a charitable organization.
Try to hide.
Yeah, can't do it. Okay, that's about it for today. That's a lot of information. Next week, once again, we're going to do Florida evidence, multiple choice for Florida evidence. We're going to pick apart a Florida con law question, and you want to be prepared for Florida con law, and family law, which is something that you could get. So we'll spend some time on that.